Hi Year 9. Okay, so the next video I'm going to do is on Crooks. Just remember, when you're learning these characters, obviously when I've got a character question, I'm thinking what's the three themes that character represents. So here, the three themes I'm going to look at in particular is Crooks represents prejudice in specifically racial prejudice. He represents the idea of the harshness and violence of society and the loneliness he feels. So remember, the fact that I'm looking at those three themes, that also covers your revision then for a theme question that could come up in the exam. So if a theme question such as discuss the theme of loneliness, or a really straightforward question like that came up, well, the revision I've done on Crooks, using a quote like, a guy goes nuts if he ain't got no body, I carry that analysis, even the link to time, over to answering that question on loneliness. Obviously, I just need to then dip into my knowledge of other characters in terms of Curly's wife loneliness, maybe Candy loneliness. So I've got a range of characters. That is if the question asks you to discuss a range of characters. But just be careful, obviously, because the question could say discuss one character or two characters. It might be specific, so always read the question carefully. Okay, let's get into it on Crooks then. Right, firstly, Crooks is the only black character on the ranch, isn't he? So that's particularly significant because being the only black character on the ranch, he is alone. He hasn't a sense of companionship from people of his own color, of his own race. So that's going to increase the sense of loneliness that he feels. The fact that the ranch is exclusively white, really, bar Crooks. I mean, it's just white people. At this time in history where society was quite prejudiced against black people, he's going to feel even more likely to be discriminated because he's going to be singled out and excluded as the sole black person on the ranch. Sometimes as to get you rolling, if you're getting like a bit of a blank in the exam, just think about the names of the characters as well to get you going if you get a bit stuck. Just like we got Curly's wife, is called the fact that Curly's wife, she's not given almost the respect of us being told her name. She's just known as Curly's wife, as if she's property of Curly, his possession, and suggesting like the second-class nature of women in the 1930s. You've got the same idea with Crooks. Crooks, he's only really known by his nickname. And obviously his name, Crooks, as a result of his crooked back. So he's not given that sort of respect, that sort of human dignity of being called by his name. And that suggests his low status on the ranch. I mean, the very fact, that's a good quote as well, the idea of his crooked back. I mean, you could talk about the theme there if we were doing a paragraph, that he represents disability or one of the disempowered or weak in the novel. The fact he's got a crooked back, I mean, that's your quote. That's not one I put down on the knowledge organizer, but it's a really good one as well. That crooked back represents almost the burden of being black, the burden of his blackness. That being a black man in 1930s USA was extremely difficult because he's constantly having to face racial discrimination all the time. And it's symbolized in physically how he feels, that he feels constant that sort of suffering, that pain, and you can see it in this crooked back, and almost like this crooked back is making him bow down, isn't it? Almost like because he's forced as a black man to constantly show respect to white people in society because they were seen at the time as being, or they viewed themselves as superior to black people, and black people being inferior. There wasn't racial equality. So Crooks is constantly in a position where he's lower to the ground. He's having to bow to show respect almost, and he's forced to do it because the nature of society was such that black people were forced to be in a position where they were treated as lower than white people. Okay, so that's a nice idea, you could say. And obviously, you see there I'm bringing the links to time. You don't have to wait to the end of your paragraph to say how time influenced the characters' behavior, attitudes, and their motives. You can sort of bring that in terms of your analysis straight away. Okay, let's go to our first quote that I've got, at least on the knowledge organizer. Crooks had his bunk in the harness room. Okay, so what am I talking about here? My point. Crooks represents the theme of prejudice, in particular racial prejudice. As we see in the text when it states, Crooks had his bunk in the harness room. This suggests that he's being physically excluded, isn't he, from spending time with or being around the white people on the ranch. He has to live on his own in this harness room. It's attached, isn't it, to the barn. It's significant because he has to live with the animals. So he's treated more like an animal in that view than a human being. And by that, it suggests that people at the time, people generally in society, viewed black people with disrespect as not being the equals of white people, that they were not given the dignity of being treated like human beings. He's having to live in the conditions of an animal. The horses that are literally just living in the same accommodation as him. Also, you can also make the link to the fact that this would have created profound loneliness, isn't it? Because he's not able to spend time regularly with the other ranchmen because they're white. They live in the bunkhouse, and he is obviously having to be in this harness room. There's so much you can say here. Again, I can zoom in on the detail that the harness room, he's surrounded, and this is another quote from chapter 4, where we've got this description of Crooks and his accommodation, as he's surrounded by his working tools. Now that's interesting, that he's constantly in a situation almost like he's chained to the ranch, isn't it? That he's constantly working. So almost the history of slavery, this legacy of slavery that was that had ended by the time, obviously, the 1930s. But the history of slavery, the history of racism is still very present in society. Black people, they might be legally free, but at least metaphorically, they're not free. They're still having to be treated that they are as if they are not equal to the rest of society, to the white people in society. What else can we say here? Okay, if we're saying link to time, a very specific link, think as a result of the Jim Crow laws, you had this racial segregation society, which physically separated black and white people. So black people had to live in a different place to white people. They had different services to white people. Society was kept separate because to enforce that emphasis of inequality, that white people were seen as superior to black people. So you've got the ranch here is a bubble or a microcosm of society more widely, that Crooks is segregated here by living in a different space to the rest of the ranchmen. Okay, second quote. Crooks says, "Get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room." Right, so what does this represent? Again, this idea of prejudice, the effects of racism in the novel. And we see this in this quote, "Get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room." So what does this tell us? Look, the tone of Crooks's voice is extremely bitter. This is the effect of racism and the treatment he constantly faces. You think how casually a word like the N-word is used. I'm saying that just in case YouTube decides that it's not education, but they're going to decide that I'm being racist. Obviously, I'm not. The N-word is in the novel, but I'm not going to use it nonetheless, okay? So the N-word is used constantly, so casually, so frequently, and shows that Crooks has to constantly experience this racism every day, just in any interactions he has with anyone else on the ranch. It's made him bitter. It's made him so bitter that he's become very proud over protecting the little and few freedoms and liberties he actually has. So when Lenny wanders into his room, straight away he's on the defensive and he's defending his own limited space of the harness room where he lives. So he's emphasizing that as a black person, he deserves to have some space. If he's excluded by white people who say that he stinks, then he should be able to protect his limited space. But underneath this, when obviously he's able to talk to Lenny a little bit more, you can see the secret he quite enjoys Lenny being there. When he says, "Oh, you may as well take a seat," because he does want companionship, but he doesn't want to be seen as, because it would affect his pride if it was seen that he really wanted that companionship. Okay, so this is the effect of racism, that the black people were treated this time in society as second-class citizens. They were treated as inferior, and this is the impact on black people emotionally and psychologically or mentally, that it changed their behavior. It almost made black people enforce this division between white and black people even more, because they were trying to protect the few rights they had. Okay. I could talk about now, I haven't put it down on the knowledge organizer, but I could talk about the harshness and violence of society, and borrow a quote from Curly's wife, where Curly's wife says, "I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." This suggests here, obviously, where he tries to defend himself and the group, where she comes in at the end of chapter 4, and he says, "Look, you need to leave now," and she enforces her power as a white woman, okay, but particularly a white person, over a black person, and attacks him with that threat that she could have him lynched. So this, again, this link to time, lynching, this hanging of black people, was extremely violent practice, which was a very real threat, and a very real thing that happened. So Crooks would have really been aware that it's something that he should be wary of when she does insinuate that threat to him. What we can say there, we zoom in, it's extremely violent and aggressive and just quite graphic, isn't it? This, "I could get you strung up on a tree," and quite shocking to us as a modern audience. But this shows that black people, as a result of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, were constantly under threat of losing their lives, of being beaten, of physical harassment and abuse, simply because they were targeted as a race that white people, certain groups of white people like the KKK, wanted to discriminate very viciously. Okay, final quote, and this is where Crooks presents the theme of loneliness, and that is shown here when he talks about, when he's confiding in Lenny about how lonely he feels being on his own as a result of the racial prejudice that separates him from white people. And he says, "A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody." Okay, so this suggests to us that it's the power of loneliness that is so powerful, it can actually make someone physically and mentally ill. When he says a guy goes nuts, almost it can make you lose your mind, because Crooks then goes on to say, doesn't he, that sometimes he sees things and there's no one around him to check if it's real or not. So loneliness can be so powerful, almost like a mental illness that can make you hallucinate and see things, and extremely damaging. So we've got this here, the importance that Steinbeck is putting across, that of companionship, of the idea of people being together. And this was so important at this time in history, that Steinbeck is showing that, or trying to get the message across, that in this time in history where people were divided as a result of racial segregation with the Jim Crow laws, as a result of migrant workers having to travel all around the country looking for scarce jobs that are available because of the huge levels of high unemployment. So they were separated from their families, separated from their friends, from the communities they came from. That sense of togetherness, to band together, was more important now and moving forward into the future than ever before. But it's the sadness and sympathy we have that for someone like Crooks, he's having to face even more challenges as a black man to find little bits of companionship. So when Crooks has Lenny come to his room and then Candy, he sort of really relishes that, because it's the small little bit of companionship that he has, where genuinely you've got particularly Lenny talking to him and not understanding racism, who simply just wants to talk to someone, and Crooks lowers his guard a bit and is quite happy of that companionship as chapter 4 goes on. Okay, I'll pause there. The next video I'm going to do is going to be on, I think, just looking at my list, I think I'm going to do Curly's wife. All right? Okay, thanks, ladies and gents.